Hello everyone, this is the TVC podcast with me, Tony Lowe. The TVC Academy is now back up, so if you go to www.thetvcacademy.com, you'll now see that my courses are available on there again. Do add the www, which is, I know, a bit old-fashioned, but we've been having some oddities with browsers. I think if you use the general browsers like Firefox and Chrome, it won't be an issue. But I personally use Brave, for example, and when I don't include the www on there, it doesn't actually go to the Academy, so just be aware of that. But yeah, the Academy is back up, so all free courses are available. I've just released a course on logic, and I'm calling it an enhanced introduction because it's about laying the conceptual foundation so we understand just what logic is and why it's so important. And not only that, but I've really tried in this series to kind of undercut a lot of misconceptions about what logic is, how we use it and its scope, because logic really is the foundation of all of our thinking. It really is. It's the anchor point of our ability to make sense and meaning of our thoughts and concepts. And so it's so essential, but it's kind of relegated to people have this idea of it being this kind of specialized thing. So that's the first kind of misnomer. But not only that, but they think it has all these kinds of limits, like that it doesn't apply to paradoxes, for example. They might say that paradoxes prove that logic doesn't really apply, or they might say that real contradictions can actually exist, which is completely illogical. And I'm trying to dissuade and show that these misnomers are not correct. In fact, logic always applies, but our ability to use it properly is limited and can be limited. So but anyway, I explained all that in the series. I've also done a course on the Socratic Method, which I think is an absolutely fantastic thing for people to learn. The short thing about the Socratic Method is if you know how to use that, you know how to correct your own thinking. That's basically it. It's a system of going back over your own thoughts and checking them for consistency to make sure that your own mind basically is harmonious with itself. So that's the main value there. And then I've also obviously got the course on the Trivium as well, which is the largest course, and that's all about going through the classical education system of grammar, logic, and rhetoric so that we can build an understanding of basically any subject. Every subject has a grammar, every subject has logic, and every subject has its rhetoric. And so if we learn the three pillars, we learn grammar, logic, and rhetoric, we can kind of get a conceptual approach to all subjects so that we can equip ourselves to think. Because at the end of the day, what I'm doing with the Academy is I'm trying to develop tools for people to think critically by themselves. I know I'm not unique in doing this, but these are facets that I'm trying to drag together so that they're all in one place. And I believe that if you learn these principles and these skills, you don't have to be given your understanding. You can actually go and develop it yourself. But there are rules that we have to play by in order for that to actually be possible. And I'm trying to extrapolate upon what those rules are and why they function and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, that's enough preamble, but I'm glad to have it back up for sure. Anyway, so this episode today, I wanted to talk about the children of the revolution. And what do I mean by that? Well, what I've got in mind, really, is the revolution of the 1960s and what has been born of that, right? I think many of us know that the 1960s and that era was really the largest cultural revolution, especially at least in the West. Could we say in all of history? I suppose maybe that's too far. Christianity was a pretty big deal when that hit in. But certainly in recent history, the amount of changes that took place during that time and the knock-on effect that's had on the culture, it was basically the break from tradition, wasn't it? It was basically that fork in the road where the younger generation said, we don't need the older generations anymore. We don't need that foundation of the past. We can break out and express ourselves in our own way and start really doing our own thing. And that's why you really have this idea of the children of the revolution, because it was really the young who pushed away from the old. Obviously, the old in their own way kind of laid the foundation for that, but also most of the old died in the wars, didn't they? It's the interesting thing about that era. A lot of the father figures who would have otherwise given that kind of old traditional patriarchal anchor to society, the society of the 60s, the boomers, should we say, their parents would have been the greatest generation, and they all were blown up in the Second World War. So in the aftermath of the war, I think everyone had this kind of cultural malaise. They had a kind of conflict left a very bad taste in their mouths, and you get this impression, at least from whether it's an accurate representation or not, you at least get the flavour of the idea that war and the fact that the old world gave rise to the First and the Second World Wars left a bad taste in everyone's mouth. And you can almost blame it on tradition, which people then started to associate with autocracy, which people started to associate with tyranny, which they also associated with the cause of war itself. And that's oversimplifying things far too much, and there are other factors at play. But, again, it's that break from the old world after the death rattle of Europe and America as well in many ways, though America really came into bloom after the wars. But it still shed enough blood during that time to want to kind of break away from how things had been and move into something new and hopeful, right? Into the new world, this new world of freedom and apparent enlightenment that was really rolling in with the 60s, yeah. And the hippies and the liberals and the communists and all the stuff that was coming through in that time. Now, what really sparked the idea for this episode was I was on site, and we have the radio blaring away whilst we're working. And the bloke I'm working with, who I'm assisting as a plumber, is he's a bit older. I think he's in his mid-60s. So around about the boomer generation, I'd say. He's more boomer than he is Gen X, for example. And it was interesting because I think one day we were talking about the current kind of weirdness with society, right? Like the way that things like transgenderism are going and how odd and distasteful that is, even for someone like himself. He's not religious in any way, but he has enough of the old values to see the new-fangled degeneracy and find that it's in bad taste, which I can understand. But here's the thing. Then he was listening to his playlist that he put on the radio. And it was all these bands like the Beatles and Led Zeppelin and Pink Floyd and all this kind of stuff. And you could see that he was really in love with all this kind of stuff and in love with what that music had spoken to him about and the way that had affected his life. And I realised that he'd been brought up on this kind of music. He'd been brought up on that part of the culture. And so the connection that came in was this idea that culture and everything it stood for is what has led to the current degeneracy, right? It's not the only thing, but everything that people like the Beatles and Led Zeppelin stood for, with their freedom of expression, with their licentiousness and break away from old ties and old culture, that logically is what paves the way for the madness that we see today. But I'm not sure how many people in that generation make the connection. It's weird. They rebel. The older generation now, because for me the older generation is the boomers, will rebel against what's been happening to, say, the millennials and Gen Z. But they don't seem to realize that they have paved the way for it, because the same values that were created during the Cultural Revolution in the 60s are completely consistent with non-binary kids being mutilated and taking hormone blockers. Now, why do I say that? Well, because the revolution was all about, what did we say? It was all about breaking away from the old and being liberated from the standards and the ties of the past, right? It was all about liberalism and freedom. Freedom, freedom, freedom to do what you want, be who you want to be, express yourself. And that's why, the kids then were wearing flare trousers and growing their hair long and started smoking pot and, started experimenting with LSD and really plugging in their guitars and making the rock and roll that set up that entire era. Because what they were doing is they were looking for that freedom, right? And that's when, things like feminism and stuff came in as well. Oh, we don't have to tie ourselves down to families anymore. All the girls want to have sex with as many people as they want. We want to have as much sex with the girls as we want without any strings attached. Everyone jumped into it. And, that's where you get, say, the breaking down of traditional family values, aside from anything else, right? Even if we don't talk about the nation and culture and that kind of stuff, the family itself was being questioned and challenged. If you look at a lot of what these musicians were pushing for, it was that break between even turning children against parents, right? Turning the young generation with all of their newfangled themes and gangs and images away from their parents who wanted things to be strict and stern and the way that things have always been. So it was always there. Now, what do you see now, right? If you see university students now denying even the concept of gender and turning away from any concept of there being a past that we have to respect and tie ourselves to, then, yeah, what's the difference, right? I mean, I know it's a difference in degree, because even when, the boomers were listening to Led Zeppelin and deciding that sex had no consequences, they would have still believed that the men are men and women are women, even though it was already being challenged by that point. But now they still want to hold on to the idea that men are men and women are women. But the kids now can turn around and say, oh, but you're just being old-fashioned, right? You are just holding on to those archaic ideas of the past. You are trying to tyrannize us with those same conceptions that you've got. And we are actually, in fact, just taking that freedom forward to its logical conclusion, right? They're wrong to do so, morally speaking. But rationally speaking, they're completely consistent to do so if we hold to the value of the 60s. Now, I don't, but the boomer did. And many other people like him. Now, that trickles down as well. That trickles down. So really, if the revolution happened during the 60s and really started to gain traction in the 70s and 80s, then the boomers were the first children of the revolution. But, Gen X then were the children of them. And by that time, those ideas were already in full swing. If by Gen X you're trying to emulate your parents and the values that they hold to, then you're emulating these same values of freedom and promiscuity and basically giving up your responsibility and this kind of stuff. So that trickles down again. That gets taught to the millennials. That also gets taught to the Zoomers. And so we are now all children of the revolution. But the revolution paved way for the exact ideas that we have today. So if you see any Gen Xers who find the modern madness distasteful, you have to roll the clock back and go, okay, but at what point? At what point did it overlap, right? You can even say this to the boomers. If you now find the modern madness distasteful, at what point did the Cultural Revolution get it wrong, right? At what point, when you were listening to the Beatles and Zeppelin, did you think, no, they've gone too far with their advocacy, freedom of expression, freedom of gender and all that kind of stuff? Did you think that David Bowie went too far when he was completely acting like a human chameleon? Or have you only thought it's gone too far now? And if it has gone too far now, by what standard do you judge that, right? So another thing I've been thinking about is the fact that there are different ways to reach falsehood. Now, one of the ways to do it is to reason fallaciously, right? Because a fallacy is technically just an error in the reasoning process. When you're not reasoning validly, then you're reasoning fallaciously. But here's the thing, you can still have a valid argument, a consistent, logical argument that uses logic properly, that still reaches false conclusions. And I believe one of the ways it does that is by having what we regard as false premises. And what I'm thinking of now is by reasoning from false axioms. Now, for those of you who don't know, an axiom is a established or assumed truth that you have in an argument, right? So one famous example of a really common axiom is the axiom that language contains meaning. Because by the time that you and I are arguing about anything, then we already assume the fact that we can actually exchange ideas in the medium of language and that has meaning. If we didn't assume that, why would we be speaking in the first place, right? So that's the idea of an axiom. Now, if you look at logical structure, they lay the foundation for our reasoning process. So you have axioms, they lay the foundation. Then you have your premises, and you go through those, and the premises then lead up to a conclusion. Anyway, why am I saying all of this? Because reasoning from faulty axioms will lead you to falsehood, right? Reasoning consistently from false axioms will lead you to falsehood. And the axiom that we had developed by the time of the 60s was the axiom that unfettered freedom for the sake of freedom itself, or for the sake of people fulfilling their hedonistic desires, was a good in its own right. Yeah. Pleasure is good, and the freedom to pursue pleasure in any way you choose is good. That's the entire excuse for what happened in the 60s. That is the entire excuse for all of these musicians and the culture of that time just doing whatever they wanted. That was the appeal of these people. They were just simply doing what they wanted. They were finally following their desires in an unfettered way without being dictated by the elders and the standards of the past, right? And they did that because they thought their own expression and their own happiness was a value unto itself. And that freedom to pursue that value is a value unto itself. Now, why have I mentioned all of this? Well, because if you then go to consider the situation of the boomer, or the situation of the guy in Generation X, or the millennial, or the zoomer, who find the current madness distasteful, who think it's wrong, for example, that, little kids are getting dragged along to drag queen shows, their axioms remain the same, though. They're still functioning on the same axioms that were seen during the revolution, right? Because if you were going to ask these people, well, you might say all this stuff is wrong, but do you think freedom is good for its own sake? Do you not think that people should have the freedom to express themselves in any way they choose? You will see the wall that they come up against, right? Because at the end of the day, that's what they still hold to as their core values. Because the most common philosophy of life that I come across now is simply people can just do whatever they want so long as they're not hurting anyone, which basically just means not hurting me, because it's like, how do you define harm? But people can define harm in whatever the way they want. So basically it's just let people do whatever they want. So long as they're not causing me any hassle or not treading on my toes, then laissez-faire. It's all good at the end of the day, isn't it? There's no counter-moral standard that these people have got in their axioms that can stand against the consequences of the Cultural Revolution. Because if you're going to say, for example, that the modern weirdness and the modern expression is wrong, then you have to say that it's wrong in relation to some other standard. But that standard has to be something other than freedom of expression for the sake of freedom of expression, right? Hedonism for the sake of hedonism. Because otherwise, what you're basically saying is, I like the fact that everyone can express themselves in any way they want, but I don't want these people to express themselves in this way because it makes me feel bad, which they can readily counter. Yeah, but isn't that just you then imposing your own values on me, which we're not allowed to do because that was the whole point of breaking away from the autocracy of the past, right? So they've got themselves kind of morally and philosophically gridlocked, I think, in that sense, even if they're not aware of the fact. Now, luckily, they're not in many cases, which gives me because if they were being completely logically consistent, then they would think themselves out of the disgust that they should rightly feel. Yeah. So there is still a little bit of cloud break there in their conscience if they know that, well, no matter how much I've gone along with this echo of the revolution, I still feel in my conscience that there's something wrong here. And I see that in all generations that have come since that time. That applies to the boomers and to Gen X and to the millennials and generations. That there are plenty of people in all of those generations who just look at the current situation and go, this is wrong. Despite the fact that their fundamental axiom is that ideal of liberalism, an ideal of freedom for freedom's sake. So that's really what I wanted to reflect on. If you are listening to this and you're the kind of person I'm speaking about, who loves, for example, what the 60s had born, what had born out of them, right? If you love all of these bands, everything from Zeppelin to Iron Maiden to Black Sabbath, if you like what's come after that through the 70s and 80s and how culture transformed, but you don't like where things are going, where the culture has come to, then I implore you to reflect on where that culture came from, right? And what that's based upon. Because it's not just a matter of the particular parts of culture, the bits that you enjoy and the bits that you don't. It's a question of what principles are that culture based on, and what principles have you accepted that allow that culture to come this far, right? I'm not saying the blame is on you personally for that reason, but it's a broad spectrum thing. Generationally, collectively, as a group, if we all kind of made that reflection, the choice would be in front of us to say, okay, so if we're going to reject this, are we also going to reject the principles as it's based on? Because what I'm trying to say is there's no point, if we wanted to roll back the clock because 2020 has gone too far, if 2022 has gone too far, if we're going to roll back the clock, there's no point in rolling back the clock to the 60s, right? Because then it will just move back into 2022, culturally speaking. If you were going to really roll back the clock to make sure that the culture of 2022 couldn't be, then you would have to place that dial, you'd have to place those hands somewhere else and in something else. And the question then would be, what would that something else be? What axioms could you appeal to? What fundamental, moral, philosophical, dare I say spiritual beliefs could you anchor society in so that culture remains sane? So it's just something to think about. Anyway, like I said, the Academy's back up, so www.thetvcacademy.com if you're interested in any of the courses. There's free previews for all of them as well. I am on YouTube, by the way, so if you just type in, I don't know if typing in TVC will be enough, but I think if you type in TVC podcast or the name of one of my episodes, then the channel will come up, because there's more stuff on there than I have just on the podcast itself if you're listening to this on Spotify or iTunes or whatever. And otherwise, I've also just got my website, which acts as a hub for all of my stuff. So that would be tonyvclow.com. That'll be all for today. God bless you. Thank you very much for your time.